Good evening, and welcome to the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas series. As Pro-Vice Chancellor, Aboriginal Leadership, and Director of the Institute of Indigenous Knowledges at the University of Tasmania, I am honoured to welcome you to Two Ways of Seeing Indigenous Rock Art, presented in collaboration with Rock Art Australia. Before we begin, I would like to pay respects to elders past and present. I would like us to reflect and pay respects to the Muwinina peoples, the traditional owners since time immemorial, the caretakers, the lovers of country here in Nipaluna. Due to effects of colonisation, the Muwinina peoples are no longer with us. But as we move forward, we always pay respects to their vision of caring for country. And I'd also like to pay respects to the Palawa peoples, the custodians who ensure that country still speaks, that connects to the powerful way that the land, that the rivers of this beautiful island shine through on a daily basis. It is so important as we learn and as we grow that we think about our Palawa community members, we think about the voice of country, we ensure that we're protecting country and we are allowing it to shine. And here in Nipaluna, we are thinking about the Muwinina peoples and their love of country forever and ever, and how we respect and honour their memory. The Island of Ideas series reflects the university's commitment to fostering critical conversations that inspire action and create meaningful change for Tasmania and beyond. Tonight's discussion is a testament to this mission as we explore the multifaceted significance of Indigenous rock art. Indigenous rock art is one of the oldest forms of human expression. More than ancient imaginary, it is a living cultural record preserving knowledge, stories, and spiritual connections passed down through generations. Tasmania's rock petroglyphs, among the oldest surviving human art forms, provide direct insights into the lives and customs of Aboriginal Tasmanians. These engravings and paintings are not merely artistic expressions. They are vital components of cultural heritage, reflecting deep connections to the land, ancestors, and Indigenous knowledges that continue to shape identity and tradition today. Like many other rock art sites across Australia, these treasures are vulnerable to environmental change, industrial impact, and neglect. Protecting them requires both Indigenous custodianship and rigorous research. Rock art connects country, culture, and community across vast distances. The Kimberley region, where Rock Art Australia conducts extensive research, holds some of the world's most significant rock art. While the rock art of Tasmania and the Kimberley differs in form and style, both represent continuous unspoken cultural traditions shaped by unique landscapes and histories. Rock Art Australia plays a vital role in this space, working alongside Aboriginal communities and scientists to protect and interpret these irreplaceable sites. I am delighted tonight that we have the opportunity to hear from two experts from Rock Art Australia, as well as our own Palawa Tasmania scholar. First, to discuss cultural heritage and historical significance of Tasmanian rock art, we will hear from Professor Greg Lehman, who is UNESCO Chair of Communication, Environment and Heritage and Professorial Fellow, the Institute of Indigenous Knowledges at the University of Tasmania. Greg is a Palawa scholar, curator, writer, and his work gives us deep understanding of Indigenous perspectives on heritage and representation. Next, we will hear from Ian Weiner. Ian is a Queenie man from the Kalumbaroo community in a far northeast corner of the Kimberley. He will talk to us about two ways to see Indigenous rock art. As a respected Balanggarra custodian and cultural advisor, he brings invaluable lived experience and deep connection to the ongoing significance of rock art for Aboriginal communities. Finally, we will hear from Emeritus Professor Andy Glendo. geologist, former head of Earth Sciences, University of Melbourne, who will provide scientific perspective on rock art dating and its broader implications for understanding deep time histories. A leading geologist and expert in radiometric dating techniques, his research has been instrumental in uncovering the timelines of ancient rock art traditions. Without further ado, allow me to welcome Professor Greg Lehman.
Thank you very much, Sadie, and thank you for saving me the trouble of introducing myself. I'm only going to speak very briefly tonight. I just want to provide I guess by way of introduction to our main talent here tonight, I just want to provide a little bit of context and just spend a little bit of time looking at some of the origins, the connections, the national and international context of Aboriginal rock art in Tasmania, and touch on some of the management issues that we have to contend with. So most of the world knows about Australian Aboriginal rock art in relation to the north of the continent. And we'll be privileged to hear about this and see examples of this work presented by Ian and Andy this evening. But before we hear from them, I'd like to take a brief look at some of the diversity of rock art in Tasmania and some of those management issues that I mentioned. To understand rock art in Tasmania, it's first essential for us to move on from our geographical assumptions about Australia. The first is that Tasmania has always been an island. This image shows the approximate location of the continental shelf. Most of this area is less than 130 metres deep. At the peak of the last ice age, the sea level was at least 125 metres lower than it is today. The ancestors of Tasmanian Aboriginal people have been living on what was a great southern peninsula for over 20,000 years, twice as long as my ancestors were living on an island. Around 13,000 years after the peak of the last ice age, the sea level, as those glaciers and ice caps retreated, rose around 60 metres. This left a narrow land bridge around a great bay that had once been a giant inland lake, 3 or 4 times the size of Lake Eyre. During this time, there were cultural connections, often referred to as dreaming tracks or songlines, across this great southern peninsula and deep into the continent of Australia. By around 7,000 years ago, the sea had risen to its current level and Tasmania was isolated. Rock art styles that developed since that time, that is after 7,000 years on the mainland of Australia, could no longer spread to Tasmania. What we now know as our island became an archive of Australia's oldest art traditions. This hand stencil is on the wall of a cave in the Craycroft Valley near the Tractor Federation Peak in southwest Tasmania. Here and in a small number of other known cave sites in the region, these hand stencils mark the most southerly living human beings on the planet at the time. The stencils were made by blowing a mixture of ochre and human blood onto an outstretched hand to mark a place of ceremony. The organic material in these stencils has been carbon dated to around 10,000 years before the present time. Similar hand stencils can be found as far away as Patagonia, the site of another, not quite as southerly dwelling population, and they date back to around the same time. Other Tasmanian carvings, made in rock shelters close to the current coastline, and therefore probably not older than around 5,000 to 7,000 years, speak to similar traditions. These feature footprints that seem to form the heads of human figures. Further up the west coast can be found more abstract patterns in the rock faces, including arrays of cupules like those that can be found in some of the oldest sites in northwestern Australia and the Kimberley. So these connections reach far and deep into time. Many of these rock art sites are protected by their remoteness and little-known locations. However, where art sites are easily accessible, they're often subject to vandalism. At Larraturnan, also known as Sundown Point, on the northern part of the west coast of Tasmania near the Arthur River, sections of rock art have been carved off. You can see in this image, have I got a pointer? Here, a section has been broken away, and up here an entire section is missing. We know that some of these sections have disappeared just in the last 20 years or so because the community visit these sites often and keep track of the integrity of these sites. Often they're just simply graffitiized. However, this mindless damage was eclipsed in the past by more official forms of desecration. During the 1950s and 60s, museums in Tasmania removed large sections of stone containing rock art from their locations on country. Their argument at the time was that weather and erosion would eventually lead to their complete loss. This is despite the fact they'd probably existed in their locations for 3, 4, 5, maybe up to 10,000 years. Here we can see one of those sections on display at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery in Hobart. Similar displays were installed at the Queen Victoria Museum and Art Gallery in Launceston. Tony Brown, pictured in this photo, is the first Aboriginal curator employed in a Tasmanian museum and was amongst those Aboriginal people who began a campaign to have these petroglyphs returned to where they belonged. In 2021, as a result of this campaigning and negotiation, the government and those two museums agreed to restore this damage by returning the carvings to the Aboriginal community. The community carefully considered the options and eventually decided that the best response was to return these cultural objects to their original locations. The damage done to rock art in Tasmania mostly occurs due to a lack of understanding and respect for the importance of these to today's Tasmanian Aboriginal community as a continuing part of Palawa culture. But they're also a unique part of Tasmania's heritage that all of us can be proud of, an internationally significant part of the deep human history of the world, right here. While there is still much work to do to create educational resources on Tasmanian rock art, Aboriginal Heritage Tasmania is working hard to document these important places. Please have a look at the Aboriginal Heritage Tasmania resources that are available online. And I thank you all very much for taking those first important steps to improving your own understanding by coming along here this evening. Thank you very much.
Hello, Tasmania. Are you guys so excited? Well, first of all, I'd like to say, what is rock art and what it means to me and my people? Well, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owner, the past and the present, my two elderly back at my community, Clumbaroo, down up north, Ogie and Ambrose. And I'd like to give thanks to Sam Hamilton, as she's a CEO of Rock Art Australia and UWA, which is known as University of Western Australia, and Melbourne University. And I'd like to give thanks to Andy, who's gonna do this, speak with me today, this lecture. Here, like me, growing up in my community, I'm from the remote community. It is, the population is 500 people that lives in my community. And I'm one of many, like 7. And my father, before he passed on, he taught us how to hunt and live off the land and sea. and especially like understanding rock art. So all my family are artistic. And Clumberoo is a very small remote community. And I was trying to understand the rock art with my father. So as you can see here, you can see Tasmanian tiger. And my people was painting it on country ever since long that we could both know. So it dated right back to tens of thousands of years. And it is one of the oldest library in the world. So you guys have like Tasmanian tiger. Well, this is the Kimberley tiger here we have, okay? Anyway, here, why is rock art important to us? It tells us our story and how people used to live back in those days, and how to find food source and water source, and understanding what is actually there on country. So as this image here, this is a saltwater turtle, what we call a jolowaro. That's a saltwater turtle. It's eatable. I don't want you guys to like, anyway. Here, this other image here is a bush yam that we call a garmango. And like telling our stories and like looking at the painting and understanding it, it like tells us all here, we know where salt water is not far. We know there's yams is around this country. So we know where is, if we can't hardly find the salt water, we know it's close by. The kangaroo is my totem. And we only eat certain kangaroos. I am an Amangari man, the Queenie man of Clumberoo. Amangari is like a kangaroo. So there's many heaps of kangaroo. There's Mangara, there's Amba, that's what Amangari means. It's like a lot of kangaroos. And it plays an important role, but it's special to my Waina family. That is our totem. And the kangaroo played an important role. What I mean by important role, he spread the news of the law from my country, from the sea to the desert. When there's young boys become men through ceremony, and I won't get into details because before the old people was burning them, you know, and what my kangaroo done, he hopped to different campground and campfire and said, oh, hang on, this is not the way to do it. They picked up the Stone Axe tool and showed them the proper way and spread the news of the law and live in harmony throughout Australia. As you can see here, we're sharing our stories to scientists, to University of, I just wanted to say Melbourne, museum at WA museum. And this guy here, Ian Crawford, I named after him because he was so special to my family and was coming up there since 1960. That's how long he bonded with us, and we were sharing two ways to see, like two different knowledge. We had his knowledge and he had our knowledge. So like he was working with the old people and learning like different ways how to see it. He was a professor in the white man ways, but he came to a different home ground. So when he came to us, we are the professors in our land. I like to acknowledge my dad. That's him there. Like he took out all different young indigenous people from different clans. And what he done, he brought them on country, like our country. And most of these students here, this indigenous student, they was from different tribe. So my dad had to get them together and start this research with the scientists and archaeologists and all that, but with TAFE at Broome. So we didn't know how to use technology. So we had to give it a go, and like navigating compass and and GPS and document art site, because we wanted to find out how old is the art, and no one knows. That's why I have all these crazy scientists with me that that definitely knows what they're doing and saying half of the time. What I mentioned earlier ago about my two elder, that's one of them, that's Ambrose, and that's Augie. So this project wouldn't end up like working without them. And it's up to us to say yes or no if scientists taking sample between like on art or under art, but it doesn't affect the art, because it's up to us to like be real careful of what they're doing, and we have to ask questions. And like the reason why we do all this, because that's a question that like I wanted to find out. There was one of the old ladies, I'll just tell you like a little quick story. There was one of these old lady from Victoria came up, and I took them out for a tour, and she asked me, how old is the painting? And the old lady was older than me. I looked at her, I said, gee, woman, it's older than me and you. That's all I can say. And so I ended up like joining Rock Art Australia to find out, like I was fascinated and really wanted to know, because with our story and the science story, like combining it together, like two ways to see, it's really give us a real solid ground that we stand on. So my two elder like work with the scientists, and what I done, I had to go to the lab to find out if they're really doing the right thing. And you know, they was, you know, otherwise I would have cracked a whip on them, you know. Yeah. So anyway, so I definitely like write this book, you know, and just to share my knowledge to everyone, and especially the world, and like everyone that needs to know about Aboriginal culture and about the rock art. Because what I see is this book, you have all the information that you need about the art, like two ways to see. And putting it down on history. When people like from overseas come into Australia, when they come into Australia, what do they like learn about history? They learn about Captain Cook. They learn about Nat Kelly. What about us, the first nation on this land? You know, but this story is not my story. It is our story to tell. Each and every one of you, this is our story. Australian backyard. This is our story to tell. That's why I put this book up. And here, like I'll tell you a story about a fire, like my people, how they manage, how we come like useful with the scientists. You see, my people, they was managing the land by making fire, just to pretend there's a riverbed, like a river bank. They burn on one side of the country to chase their animals like the kangaroos and goannas to the other side. And then when the ground get like flat and like calm down and cool, they burn back and they chase the animal back to the other side, not just burning both ways to destroy the animals. That's how they like do fire management and like manage the land and stuff like that to keep it healthy. And this is where like science comes into it, because Andy will like explain more about the charcoal and the carbon dating with that. So what I'll do is I'll pass you on to Andy. He will like explain more with the science side. But if there's a lot of questions that you need to ask later. So I'll pass you on to Andy.
I'm going to talk about the crazy scientists, of which I am the chief crazy scientist. And Ian and I have worked together on this both before the project began 12 or 15 years ago, but for the last 10 years, up until about a year ago, we've been running a very large research project with researchers, about 20 researchers, fluctuated a little bit over that time, but up to 22 researchers from all around Australia, one from the UK, and a similar number of traditional owners, Ian and his people from Columbaroo principally. And it has been, well, it's been the privilege of a lifetime to be involved in this work. And I just want to begin by looking at, as a geologist, how would I look at this? The first question I had in my mind was, where is the rock art located? Is it just everywhere around the thing? But it turns out not to be. And one of the first things that I and the other geoscientists, geochemists, geologists, geophysicists, all involved in this project, worked out was that the rock art is actually confined to just two geological formations, two sandstone formations called the Wharton Sandstone in the pink colour, the magenta colour up and down the middle particularly. That is the Carson Escarpment that you can see a photograph of there. That is the edge of the Wharton Sandstone. And near that edge, that enormous cliff up to 80 to 100 metres high, below, a little bit below that sometimes, but mostly above it in the sort of rounded top of that cliff is where many of the rock art sites occur. So that actually gave us an ability to predict where many of the rock art sites would be. The other formation is the Wanamin-Millawandi sandstone, the orange-coloured rock there, another sandstone formation with very similar physical properties that has, in fact, also many, many rock art sites. But there are tens of thousands of rock art sites across the Kimberley, and they display an enormous variety, not only geographically, but in depth, as it were, in time, and understanding what that time was and how long the different periods that we can identify had lasted for. That's what we set out to do. At the beginning of the project in 2014, we didn't know how we were going to do it. I had 4 different techniques in mind that I thought might be worth a crack. And in fact, all 4 of them have come up with useful results, but one of them has been a spectacular winner. But when we actually, I'm going to show you a little bit of the rock art first. And of course, all of this is done with permission of Augie Unhango, the senior traditional owner for the area where these photographs are taken, Ian's elder, who he's talked about, and now one of my dearest friends. It's the most astonishing thing, if you asked all of us at the beginning of this project what we expected to get out of this project. We would hope to get some dates and all that. What we didn't realise, that we were forming lifelong friendships with First Nations Australians that we would never have even met otherwise. And it's just been an extraordinary journey. When we look at a rock shelter like this, and these 3D models really show you how alive they are, you can see that there are paintings. It's a beautiful panel. It's not terribly big. It's only about, a metre high. And if you can see different figures there which have a certain set of characteristics, but some of them have faded more than others. They're all a little bit faded, but some more than others. But you can see this dropped block on the right-hand side, which is actually showing you that the art gallery, as it were, is not permanent. They actually change over time. And this is the ultimate limit on how long the rock art can survive. You can see the figure, there's 2 legs on the fallen block, and the top of that figure is in fact up here, and you can see the legs down here. It's a dramatic example of the changes, some of the changes that can occur. But the striking thing about the Kimberley is that there are at least 6 major periods of rock art with completely different styles. And they have been painted, in many cases, they have been painted on top of one another. So we actually knew at the beginning of the project a relative sequence. We knew that this particular style, which we call the irregular infill animal period, because They are mostly paintings of animals. It's all about the abundance of the natural environment, the food sources, the variety of animals at any one place, and many of the food plants as well as that. And mostly the only human evidence you see is the handprints. And these are handprints that have been dipped in ochre and placed against the rock face. But the animals are painted with anatomically extremely accurate outlines, and they are filled in with an irregular pattern of mostly dashes, sometimes dots, and sometimes dots and dashes, as in the bird up in the top middle part there. And the dotted kangaroo on the right-hand side there actually has some anthropomorphic figures, some human figures, painted on top of it. So we know, and that they belong to the next major style. I'm only going to show you 3 of these periods, but there are 6 of them, in fact, and some of those can be subdivided into as many as 10 different subphases. So an extraordinary progression. And there, to my knowledge, there is nothing like this anywhere else in the world. There are places with different styles and they vary. Arnhem Land is the closest. It has a similar sequence, but it's not as clearly defined as in the Kimberley. And this is just one of the most amazing things. As we move younger, we see figures like this one. These were the ones that were over that dotted kangaroo, and they are very stylized human figures. They are very in fairly stiff poses, but quite often with bent knees and other things like that. And they are all in decorative ceremonial dress. They're never just people going around their everyday business. They are in ceremonial dress. Ceremony is the culturally central focus of this particular period. And these are often painted over the irregular infill animal period. Many of these figures have headdresses, conical headdresses, which look, if you look at the figure on the left-hand side in the middle here, look at the size of this headdress with a big tassel on it. And you think, how could that possibly be? And I'm going to return to this point later. How could you carry something like that on your head? And it seems like they are exaggerated, but we'll see later that in fact they're not at all. And then the youngest phase is called the Wandjina phase. And this is dominated by multicolored polychrome paintings with white and reds and yellows and black. But the black is very often powdered charcoal. And that's very easy to date with radiocarbon dating. And when we began the project, there were about 25 or 30 radiocarbon dates on these, and most of them are very young, mostly at 200 or 300 years old. And this style is continuous with the modern culture largely to the west of where Ian's people come from. But they paint animals and these spirit beings, the Wandjinas, with 2 big elliptical eyes and a nose, but never a mouth, and a rayed headdress around them. They are associated with the big thunder clouds that rise in the wet season and the bringing of the rain in the wet season. But there are many, many stories about these different Wandjinas in different places, and they all have their home bases. But the paintings are quite extraordinary. So this sequence, and I've put this as a stack on the left there, there are some engravings earlier, but mostly it's a painted art sequence. They were stacked in a relative sequence with quite a lot of dates on the Wandjina, but most of the Wandjina dates are less than 1,000 years. There's a few between 1,000 and 2,000, and there's one figure that was 3,800 years old when we began the project. And so this is a relatively recent phase, although if you look at North American rock art, this spans the entire period of rock art that has been dated in North America. It's much, much, much younger. If we look on the right here, we see a close-up picture of one of the legs of one of these Guion figures, or Kirakiro in different language. And we can magnify that and look at it. We see that there's really not much paint, not much pigment left on the surface. So you can quite easily see the paintings, but when you move in closer and closer, mostly what you see is the quartz grains the quartz sand grains in the sandstone and just little bits of pigment left in the pore spaces between the sand grains. And there's really nothing there at all that you can date. And the iron ochres, the iron oxides which make up the ochres, they are not datable in any meaningful sense at all. So, and there's no organic material left in them. These are very ancient. And so they can't be dated by that kind of approach. So how do we do it? How do we do it? Well, one really important constraint on the ages is that we know a lot from fossil evidence and subfossil evidence, just bone accumulations in caves in various parts of Australia, that there was a marsupial megafauna occupying much of the continent, or presumably most of the continent, back at times that are mostly older than about 40,000 years. There've been a lot of dating work has been done on on excavations in some of the bone beds, and it seems that most of these giant animals, like the sort of rhinoceros-sized wombat, the diprotodont, which were huge lumbering animals, there's nothing in the rock art that looks like that, absolutely nothing. And the Genyornis, the giant sort of flightless bird, which was much, much bigger than an emu, there's fossils both of a diprotodont and a Genyornis from the Melbourne Museum shown at the top there. And some of the other things, it's not, and the flat-faced, the giant kangaroos with very flat faces like the Procoptodon. There's no convincing evidence that any of these things exist. The one thing and it's very hard to tell with the giant monitor lizards that are like the Komodo dragon, only bigger, they look pretty much like a goanna, but they're just much bigger. So if you don't have a scale in the painting, it's not easy to tell. It's possible that they were there, but there's not many paintings of goannas anyway. The Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion in the middle there. Here, there has been speculation that one of these things, or a couple of paintings, might have been Thylacoleo, but I'm not convinced by it. I've seen them, and I think they are just relatively poorly drawn thylacines. And as Ian has shown you, the thylacines are present in the paint. And there's an exaggerated colour version of one over there on the left. They're quite common amongst the irregular infill animal period, that earliest painted style. But none of the other ones are there. And that strongly suggests that these paintings are all younger than about 40,000 years. So how do we do it? We can't date the pigments except for the Wandjina phase, and they're all very young. That culture seemed to be expanding and becoming more pronounced towards European contact. But if we look at this magnificent site that Ian showed you before with the giant red kangaroo in the middle, you can see that there are fallen slabs of sandstone making up the floor. That's typical of the rock shelters in this whole region of the Kimberley. And that's become very important to us because that is the mechanism whereby the rock shelters form and ultimately are destroyed. But in looking at the materials, we've done a tremendous amount of work to try and understand everything that is going on the rock surfaces, to try and find something in the long history of exposure to the elements that we could date. And we've been successful. Beyond my wildest dreams, actually, when I put the project originally together back in 2012. One of the really interesting things that is extremely common across the rock faces are remnants of mud wasp nests. And mud wasps, very obligingly, there's a photograph of one building a nest here, one of the many. There's quite a few different species of these. They build little cells, and the cells are individually about the size of your fingertip, little elliptical cells, and they cover them over. And then depending on the species of mud wasp nest, they will go and sting a caterpillar. Some of them sting spiders and put them in, and they're still alive. They're just anaesthetized. They're paralyzed. And then they lay their eggs on this supply of fresh meat, and then they seal the nest over. So when the eggs hatch, they have this big meal of all this wonderful anaesthetised fresh meat there, and then they eventually come out. But these nests, when they're first formed, there's a row of cells, and the wasps cover this with a big mound of mud. And where are they getting that mud from? They get the mud from the topsoil around the rock shelters, sometimes in the rock shelters. And that mud that they scrape a little ball together, and they actually ingest moisture, and they make a ball of mud out of it. That mud contains little particles of charcoal from the last fire that went through. And this is the relevance of the story Ian told at the beginning. And this is because this is part of the ongoing cultural management of the landscape. This has been happening regularly. On average now, today, every part of the Kimberley is burnt about every 3 years. So at any one time, the absolute topsoil, the dusty layer on top, it may have charcoal from the last 10 or 20 years. But if you're talking about 1,000 years or 10,000 years, that's nothing. And we've done a lot of dates of modern mud wasp nests from that. But it took 5 years to crack how to do that. It couldn't be done when we began the project. There are also, on many of the rock surfaces, some on the back walls, but particularly on the lower surfaces, there are mineral accretions making glossy coatings on the rock surfaces. And when you look at these under a microscope, they are finely laminated. They're only about 1, 2, maybe 3 millimetres thick at the most. But within those, there are multiple fine layers, which we've found we can actually date some of those materials. They have calcium oxalates in them, which are carbon bearing, and they're well crystallized. If you look at them under a microscope, you can see the little crystals of these, and they are quite securely datable right back to tens of thousands of years. The other thing that happens is that when these rock slabs fall, they become exposed to the sky, and from the sky we get cosmic rays all the time, all around us, going straight through us, but they impact the surface of the sandstone. Now that it's no longer protected by metres of rock above it, it's fallen down and slid out a bit of the rock shelter, it starts to receive cosmic radiation, and that induces tiny amounts of radioactive element, particularly aluminium-26 and beryllium-10, and they come from fast neutrons hitting the atoms of silicon and oxygen in the silicon dioxide, the quartz grains in the sandstone. So we used various different techniques. We had access to various instruments, national research infrastructure at different parts of the country, to use a technique called optically stimulated luminescence, OSL to its friends, which can actually date the time that sand grains, single grains of quartz, were buried and protected from light. And they build up a signal that you can release by shining light or a laser on it, and the intensity of the light given off, it tells you how old it is, roughly. And that can only be applied to very big mud wasp nests. Then you can only date the back layer, but those mud wasp nests are multi-generational. They go back and build nests. So the data are actually pretty hard to interpret in many cases. And we use gigantic instruments up at ANSTO, the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation at Lucas Heights, just south of Sydney. And here's Damien Finch, one of our researchers, kissing this giant Antares machine, which his whole PhD was based on, and all the work he's done since the PhD. And that can be used to measure radiocarbon, carbon-14, beryllium-10 and aluminium-26. And that instrument you wouldn't fit it in this room. The main part of it you would, but the beam lines at each end of it they're almost the size of a soccer field from the beginning to the end. Extraordinary. But you can measure single atoms that are flying down that path every now and again. You literally can hear a ping every now and again when one of the atoms you're interested in, because the abundance of those beryllium-10 and aluminium-26 atoms is about the same as identifying 1 grain of rice amongst all the rice in the world. And you can do it with that machine. And that was one of the things that led me to put the project together, because I said, if there are things there today we can measure them. We have the instruments, and we have other instruments like inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometers, like this one at Melbourne. We have about 5 of those at the University of Melbourne. There's many of them. There are some here at the University of Tasmania. That can measure uranium-238 and thorium-230, which can be used for another technique when you get the appropriate materials. And some of the minerals in the mineral accretions concentrate tiny amounts of uranium. So we've tried OSL dating on large mud wasp nests. We've tried these accelerator mass spectrometers, carbon-14 dating on the remnants, the tiny little remnants of the single cells of the mud wasp nests, like here. And this one here has been painted over, and that is the key to it. These nest remnants are obligingly put there by the mud wasp nest every year. And most of it crumbles away, but the stuff that is against the rock wall becomes fossilized, and it stays there, and it protects the little particles of charcoal, which were the tips of spinifex, grass leaves, as when the fires went through. And it's an extraordinary thing. I thought at the beginning that if we could find a way to date those, we would solve the problem of how to date the rock art. And I had a very brave retired engineer who wanted to do a PhD on this stuff, and he doggedly worked on this for 5 years, and in the last year finally cracked it. And since then, we've done another 500 dates. He did 75 in his PhD. He's now done another 500. So we've got a really good data sets, and we can apply statistics to it, because if you're dating something that is older than a painting because it's underneath, gives you a maximum age for the painting, and something that's on top of the painting that gives you a minimum age, you've got to do a lot of those to be able to bracket the ages of these particular rock art styles down. So, but one of the things that I've been working on is how the rock shelters actually form. And I've told you a little of this already. They become undermined. Gravity is pushing down on these rocks, and where you get a weak layer, a shale layer or something between the sandstones, you get a tremendous crushing of those rocks, and they chip away at the front, and you get a cave developing, which is a very narrow, low cave, often only about 0.5 metre high, and it undermines. It gradually retreats, and it undermines the next sandstone layer above it, and eventually gravity wins, and that sandstone slab falls to the floor. But because of the shape of the floors, they tend to fall down and out, and then they become exposed to cosmic rays, and we can date when the rock falls form. So they do this, and then later on another one may enlarge the cave, and then the cosmic rays can tell us when those events occurred. And we've Record Phillip at the ANSTO has been doing beryllium-10 cosmogenic ages on these, cosmogenic radionuclide ages, up and down the escarpment of the edge of the Wharton sandstone here, many rock shelters through here, and has produced a range of ages showing some of the rock falls have happened almost yesterday. In fact, one of them happened between 2 field seasons. It was still on the roof, and at the end of the next time we went back there in 2019, it had fallen. And so there's a tremendous range of these ages from almost nothing. So this is a continuous process, and it is ultimately destroying the rock paintings that are on the ceiling, and eventually it destroys the rock shelter itself. But here's an example applied to one particular rock shelter. This one is 42,000 years old. That rock slab that has fallen towards the camera, opening up that shelter behind it, which is covered in beautiful, huge Kirakiro, Guyon paintings, but you can't see them very well in this photograph. And that slab fell out of there and rotated towards the camera 42,000 years ago. So all the paintings there on the back wall and on the roof have to be younger than 42,000. And of course, in many of these shelters, there are multiple generations of these rock falls. So that's one way we've done it, but it's also shown us that the rock shelters, they begin by being undermined in the first stages there. Eventually, a slab falls from the ceiling, and that opens up what I call a corridor cave behind it in here, which with these beautiful new fractured surfaces to paint on. And people don't waste much time when a nice new fractured surface is there. they get painted on. And the ceilings, the new ceilings as well. And then, of course, another one can fall and enlarge the rock shelter. It may take some paintings down with it, and we've found slabs that have got paintings underneath them, as well as new paintings on the rock ceiling. So dating the fall tells us both a minimum and a maximum age for those different painting styles. But eventually, the whole rock shelter topples forward because the undermining is so deep, and then literally the art gallery has fallen over, and the art is lost. The mineral, I'm not going to dwell on these mineral accretions. We've done a lot of work on these, but the point I want to make is that the interior of these rock shelters are so protected from the elements. There is actually no erosion going on at all in the rock shelters, because if there was, you wouldn't get the mineral accretions building up. They are actually depositional environments. They are accretionary environments with material being deposited and building up on the rock surfaces. Those deposits can actually damage the rock art, and in the next phase of the research, we'll be trying to put what we've learned to work to understand what can be done to at least stabilise these processes so that no further damage is done to the rock art. If you look at some of these mineral accretions under an electron microscope, you see extraordinarily detailed mats of crystals, well crystallized minerals of various kinds. And this means that these are, because they are intact crystals and they're not corroded in any way, these are very good materials to retain a radiometric age, a radiocarbon age for the oxalate mineral grains that are in there. And some of these chunky crystals like that are calcium oxalate grains, and they can be dated by radiocarbon. And if they're related to paintings or engravings, as they are here, many of these incrustations on the low angle, on the floors or ledges, many of these have been engraved. They've got patterns of rock markings on them, because these coatings are actually very soft relative to the very tough, hard sandstone underneath. So if you're going to actually scratch something and make a long-lived pattern, these mineral accretions are the place to do it. And you find very commonly that these are covered in patterns of rock markings. And some of these are almost certainly the oldest art, if you call them art, in the whole of the Kimberley region. But even more important than that, the layers within those mineral accretions, we can date them layer by layer, and they actually contain a climatic record of changing climates within the very rock shelters that we're looking and studying the rock art. This shows you, this is one of our archaeologists, Sven Oosman from UWA, who is looking at a panel there, and it's hard to see that it's a rock art panel until you can see some of the paintings there. But if you mess around with the colours, as we do, there's a program that exaggerates in all sorts of absurd ways. It exaggerates the colours, and you can see the pattern of flying foxes hanging upside down from the little ceiling there. And there's a whole row of them, probably painted at almost the same time, if not exactly the same time. But on top of them, circled there in yellow, are two large mud wasp nests, which were suitable for dating by, I'll go back to the ordinary colour, suitable for dating by the OSL, the luminescence dating method. And the ages for those, the left-hand one was 11,200 years, plus or minus about 800, and the right-hand one was 14,600, plus or minus 700. Some evidence of scattered ages with later generations of deposition of wasp nests there, but it shows that that panel of paintings is greater than 14,600 years old. Now I'm going to just quickly go through the accelerator mass spectrometry radiocarbon dates from the Damien Finch's work, tremendously detailed work. And he's showing on this panel here a whole lot of Kirakiro or Guyon paintings, and some of them the rock, the wasp nests are actually on top of the paintings, the blue. That means that these are the dates against the scale down the bottom. The painting must be something older than that. And if the nest is underneath, it must be, that gives a maximum age, the painting must be younger than that. And they're actually, this is the results he had in his PhD. We have many more now, and the pattern is holding. This shows that there was a tremendous culmination in this style around 12,000 years ago, and maybe 11 to 13,000. And there is some evidence that some of these go back even older still, but that was somewhat of a surprise that there was seemed to be a fairly narrow distribution revealed by the statistical techniques that Damien developed. The irregular infill animal period, remember the most ancient of the styles in that relative sequence, the ages are older, and they seem to cluster around 15 to maybe down to 14, 13,000 years, but now with the newer dates, they go back just touching 20,000 years. This is a fairly long-lived, fairly conservative style because they were just painting what was around them, so that didn't change. And these go back to 20,000 years. The importance of that date is that it is the last glacial maximum, the last ice age that Greg was telling us about before, when sea levels globally were about 130 metres lower than they are today. You could walk to Tasmania, as Greg explained. You could walk from Papua New Guinea into Australia, and you could almost walk from Indonesia, but not quite. There was never a time when you could get into Australia from outside by walking. You had to have a boat. But these irregular infill paintings are extraordinary. There was one particular kangaroo that is illustrated in a mosaic of photographs on the right. This is on a partly fallen ceiling slab, and because it's partly fallen, you can only ever look at it about half a metre away, and you can only photograph about this much at a time. So that's a mosaic of about 50 photographs to actually build up a picture of this 2-metre long kangaroo. If we exaggerate the colours, you can see it a little more clearly, but Pauline Heaney, who's one of our rock art documentation specialists, and she is also a graphic artist, and she overdraws many of these to show exactly what that kangaroo looked like. It's 2 metres from the tip of its ears to the tip of its tail, and Damien had 3 nests he could date underneath it and 3 on top, and that kangaroo painting was dated to 17,300 years plus or minus 100. That's actually been recalibrated. We've done some new calibration experiments that affect the very oldest dates, and that's pushed back a little bit now, but not hugely, but it's just a bit further back in time. And we have paintings going back to just on 20,000. So we actually have a sequence of dates for the different style periods now. What does that enable us to do? I mean, when you just have the paintings to look at, you can't relate those to anything else that has been happening in the long history of human habitation in this region. But now that we do, if we look at those sea level changes, the effects of those sea level changes were profound on the Kimberley. It's a very shallow continental shelf, and it's up to 500 kilometres wide. So when you drop down to 130 metres below the present day level, there are vast areas, hundreds of kilometres of land exposed. And we see in the Joseph Bonaparte Gulf here that there was a wonderful large freshwater lake system, beautiful place for animals, for fish, a wonderful place for people to live. And there were undoubtedly populations of people living out on the continental shelf. The dark green area there shows you where the sea level was at the outer edge of that at 17,300 years when that kangaroo was dated. The pale green shows you where the sea had risen to at 12,000 years when that culmination in the Kirakiro Guion paintings occurred. Very different worlds. And by that time, the people who were living out on that what is now continental shelf must have migrated inland. And that's when we see this emphasis on culture, on ceremonies, becoming the dominant feature of the paintings. So we have a new timeline now for the rock paintings. And if we look at that in relationship to some of the global climate records from Antarctic ice cores in the blue curve at the bottom there, and from ocean sediment cores, drill cores into the deep ocean floor, they give exactly the same pattern of very low sea levels during the last glacial maximum here, from about 25,000 through to about 18 or 17,000 years, and then a sharp rise in sea levels. There was a little bit of a wiggle in the northern hemisphere, at least around just under 12,000 years ago, and that is taken as the boundary between the Pleistocene period and the Holocene, and then fairly stable conditions throughout the Holocene. That is the time that agriculture has been developed in various parts of the world, and essentially all of written history dates from the latter part of that. But that period of those dramatic sea level rise, that corresponds to the period of these amazing irregular infill animal period paintings. And as the sea levels got towards the present day, then we see that period of the Kirakiro Guion. I could go on forever on this, but but we'll move on. Oh, well, no, there's just one last thing there. The yellow curve I've added there is actually some new evidence published just last year from charcoal particles recorded in lake sediments in the Northern Territory. And it shows the charcoal abundance increasing during that same period of sea level rise, being very low, increasing, and then much higher. In fact, it's very much higher. That's a logarithmic scale there. But it shows the same pattern, those same charcoal particles formed by the fires that people were making to manage the land. So very intimate connection. I mentioned the long headdresses, which look preposterously long. They look like they have to be exaggerated, but they're not. These are two photographs taken by an early missionary, the Reverend J.R.B. Love, in 1929, of ceremonies being performed about 100 kilometres to the west of Ian's community. But they're wearing exactly these sorts of ludicrously long headdresses made out of paper bark and the long bundles of the long speargrass, which are very light, mostly air, and you can actually make these. But the remarkable thing is that those paintings were not what was being painted at the time. They were painting Wandjina paintings, Wandjina style paintings. But the ceremonies here have persisted for at least 12,000 years, being handed on from generation to generation. That is absolutely astonishing. So in all of this, we have, I'm going to skip that, that's just a summary of everything that we've learned. In all of this, we have learnt a new perspective on the deep history of Australia. It is not just the story of Australia, of the people who live there, of Ian's family and clan who live there, whose ancestors painted this. This is something of enormous importance to all of us who today call Australia home. And I hope that the work we're doing and the work that other people will go on to do in collaboration with the traditional owners like Ian and the others from Columbaroo will really profoundly change our perspective on the history of Australia. And none of this work, as Ian has already said, could have happened without Augie Unhango and Ambrose Chalarumeri, the senior traditional owners who speak for that country, and to whom Ian and all of the other younger people who've worked with us report constantly. And they have been happy with what we do. If they don't want us to take we take tiny samples. We have worked together for 10 years to figure out how can we collect a little bit of that mud wasp without disturbing the paint on top of it. And we've come up together. And in fact, in the last 5 years, all of the sample collection has been done by the younger traditional owners working with us. This has been an amazing journey, and it has been totally a two ways to see, the two different perspectives that you've heard about tonight. We have learned, we researchers came in with all our sort of tricks and things and knowledge and stuff, thinking we knew it all, and we've learned so much from our dear friends in Columbaroo and other parts of the Kimberley. It's been both hugely enriching and wonderfully humbling experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. I know as a Wiradjuri person, my community is doing so much work around how do we keep our sacred knowledge, how do we keep that knowledge and that story of many, many thousands of years strong. And it's just so exciting to hear that amazing partnership, that collaboration between science and knowledge, and how that can come together and how that can shine through. So I might take the first question from the room, one of our amazing colleagues.
Ian, thank you very, very much. This takes me back to a time I had a conversation with you in Columbaroo,
Yes.
and talking with Augie about your culture. I've always wondered about fire. As we flew to Columbaroo at this time of the year and, you know, going into the early dry season, seeing the fire. And fire, some people say, is the biggest threat to rock art. But then we've heard today how it's been a wonderful tool for dating rock art. How do you balance fire with preservation?
What do you mean, like fire preservation?
Well,
what does that mean first?
So
Preservation.
Yeah,
like I need to understand that, so I'll probably answer
I
your
guess
press.
the burning, the checkerboard burning. You know, and Augie told me about how he goes up in a helicopter and they use GPS and they burn in a pattern. But does that put rock art at risk?
No, it actually doesn't. You know, like back in the days, right? How I was explaining earlier ago, like how people used to burn. And now there's new crazy technology, like, you know, like the chopper. That like mark different areas where and where not to burn, so it won't be a threat with the art. So that's pretty much you wanted to know? Yeah.
Could I chip in on that? We've looked at thousands of rock art sites together, and I'm actually pretty convinced that fire is not the major threat to the rock art. There are people who very freely say this, but they're doing it without evidence. And the rock art survives near passes of fire. If you get something like a fallen dead tree that falls into the rock shelter and is under it, yes, it will damage it. One of the worst damages was actually where a platform had been built with a railing to enable people to look at the rock art, and it was made with one of those plastic composite materials, and the fire came through. And of course, this was incredibly inflammable and did a huge amount of damage. But the ordinary fires, right way fire, as the people do it, was regular burns, low intensity, early in the dry season, not towards the end where everything is parched. Then I don't believe it does a lot of damage. It can occasionally, but mostly it's not the fundamental problem.
Yeah, I wouldn't think it's a fire. It's gotta be like tourists or like feral animals, you know, like when there's cows that goes and rub against the art and all that. That's a thing that we need to be prepared of, you know, and trying to go back there and look after the art side just to keep it going for the young generation, you know, like I don't know if there's any funding to do all those things, you know, like who knows, you know, like that's the thing that we need to keep Australia alive, you know, and the art and the story, what is behind Australia. Yeah.
Some of our colleagues are getting another new project together who are going to focus on the actual threats, to understanding scientifically the actual threats to the art. And many of the flaking you see sometimes is not actually fire, it's just a natural process. We need to understand the natural processes first. It may be that fire might enhance those sometimes, but I don't think that all of those tens of thousands of sites across the Kimberley are in, you know, looking at a major threat from fire in the near future. Yeah.
So important, that traditional knowledge and how that traditional knowledge protects country and protects protects ways that we engage with country as Aboriginal and Torres Strait people. I'm going to have the next question now online. Francisco says, the absence of megafauna as a time maker for the rock art might pose problems. If one follows this logic, then during the earliest phase of rock art, one would think that people were also very rare in the landscape, given that only animals were depicted. Is there other fauna, non-mega, that represented the art access to different phases of the sequence, or are the animals that we know existed for the past 40,000 years in the landscape that were not chosen to be depicted?
It's quite possible that, but you would think that somewhere something so dramatic as some of those giant animals would make their way into the stories that are being depicted, maybe even the food chain that's being depicted. I think it's very unlikely that if they were there, they would be missing from the paintings. But it's still something that we don't know enough about. And there needs to be a lot more investigation of some of the examples which have been claimed to be depicting, but they're so rare. They're 1 in 10,000 paintings might be one of these things that people have suggested might be. And the ones that have been suggested to be Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion, for example, has exactly the stripes on its back that a thylacine does. So it's far more likely, in my opinion, that it is in fact a thylacine rather than and it's got a rather blobby shaped head, which doesn't look like an actual accurate depiction of the animal. Yeah.
The truth in story of connecting knowledge that is thousands of years old versus the knowledge of a colonial existence. I think it's so important for us to reflect on the fact that story and culture and flora and fauna actually connect much more significantly than we would think in this day and age. Another question in the room.
Sorry, I wanted to say something there. Yeah.
Yes. Another question in the room.
Thank you, Ian. 2 questions for you.
Whoa.
And so glad to hear what you have to say. Do you have a story about the sea level rising? And if you do, is that a story you can share with us?
Story of the sea level rising. No, I don't think we have the stories for that.
No, sure. And the other thing
But we do have stories about the flood. This is not like flood that, like Noah. We have those stories before, we have those stories. And we have similar stories like the Bible, like how to live in harmony. And we have those stories like ever since, it's just written. It's just written on the face of the rocks. And we heard all different stories, like stories of how to I'm gonna use Christianity into this now, if that's okay. Oh, all right. Anyway, how can I say this? Have you guys ever seen 10 Commandments? I'm just gonna use this story just for like how Moses went to. Really much know my Bibles now. So this is where Moses went to Mount Sinai, right? And he received God's law, came down, and told those people, let them who wants to come into the Lord's side, come to me. So the ones that didn't sin came to him, and the one that did sin got destroyed by God. Okay, you compare this story with our story. At my community, there's an island there. They had 3 wise men. They went out to the inland, and he told the people, don't go waji. Waji mean don't go wrong way, like brother seeing sister, or mother sleeping with a son, and all those things. So the one that listened, they survived. So the 3 wise men went into inland, that's in my community, and they came back, and they saw a lot of people went wrong way. And he got the stone axe tool and those giant Boab tree, and he struck the Boab nut tree. So all the ongur, all the earthworm came, and the one that sinned, was eating them alive. So they couldn't survive. The one did, he took them into the promised land. So we have those paintings, we have those stories. We didn't have those stories from the 10 Commandments, that's for sure. You know, like, I mean, I'm just using that for an example. And what is your next question?
Thank you. One of the stories on the wall, the story about the Kira Kiro Guion figures. Who are they? What are they?
Who are they and what are they? Well, you seen those people who are there? That's the evidence there. That's them. And that's like people who are there before them, you know, and all that. That's just human being that been in this continent for many thousands of years.
Genealogy. I have another question online from Darren. Are there any other new experimental dating techniques on the horizon? This might be for Andy.
We've tried everything that we have functioning now that we thought might have potential, but that doesn't exclude other ones. There are other ways. They're mostly variants of techniques. There's not many techniques that will ultimately be possible that haven't been tried in some way. And most of my work's been in geological dating on much longer timescales, but there are other variants of the process that's responsible for luminescence, for example, that measures it a different way, electron spin resonance dating, that might have some application that hasn't been tried yet. We may well find ways of dating much smaller amounts reliably. When we get down to such tiny amounts of carbon, you can still make measurements with those machines. We can find those atoms, but it's so easy for them to be contaminated by modern carbon, which overwhelms the signal. So I think we will learn how to do things better and better. I mean, if we've made that much headway in 10 years, what could we do if we keep doing this for 20 or 30? Because techniques are always getting better and the instruments are getting better. So I don't have any techniques in mind other than perhaps ESR dating that we haven't tried in some way, but there's some we've tried and have not been terribly successful. The uranium-thorium dating, for example, we think we can now use the radiocarbon dates to calibrate that and overcome the problems that have stopped that being useful. So the technology, the ideas will continue to evolve, but fundamentally new techniques that have never been thought of before, I don't know that there will be many. There may be, and I'd be very excited if there were.
Thank you so much. And we do have probably one last question right up here in the...
Thank you. Look, thank you. Very interesting. My question, I guess, has already been partly answered, but the other part is, are there geological formations now flooded that may have been the potential for cave art? And is there any traditional oral tradition about art having been done in that area that is now flooded?
Well, a lot of people are thinking about, you know, how much rock art was out there on what is now the flooded continental shelf. It's a pretty tough environment for rock art to survive in, but that doesn't mean it's not there. And you may have to remove layers of biological incrustation over the thing. But I tell you what, there's quite a lot of marine archaeologists who are looking at this and are thinking that's really going to be worth a try. I can't imagine that if people were painting on what was land then, weren't doing that on what was dry land out what is now sea. Yeah.
So we have run out of time for questions this evening, but before we go, I'd like to introduce you to Samantha Hamilton, the CEO of Rock Art Australia, who will share a few words with us. Samantha leads Rock Art Australia's mission to support research, protection and greater awareness of Australia's incredible rock art heritage. Please welcome Samantha.
Thank you. I just want to thank you all firstly for coming tonight. It's such a wonderful turnout, and I know there's also lots of people online. So I really just want to sincerely thank everybody for taking the time to listen and to engage. I also want to thank the University of Tasmania. Thank you all for having us here. It's been a delight to be here. As you just heard, Andy, Ian and I are representing Rock Art Australia, and I just wanted to tell you a little bit about who we are. So we're a not-for-profit organisation that is solely dedicated to protecting, to preserving, to documenting, to researching, and then promoting, sharing that information about rock art in Australia. And it's a really important thing, as you just heard. Rock art, what we believe rock art does is it tells us, it uncovers these incredible stories about our Australian story, isn't it? It's our Australian history, and they're our oldest libraries. And that evidence is there, and it's something for us to research and to explore. You heard tonight that the rock art tells us about what people ate, what people saw, what people believed, their spiritual, their social beliefs, their cultural beliefs, their spiritual beliefs. And what it also tells us is how people were resilient in the past. You've heard about climate change, and you've heard that sea levels rose and the climate and the environment changed over time. And that rock art tells us that. It's evidence. It's, they're our oldest libraries, they're our oldest photographs as such. And they're so important. So we really, really believe in this, and we dedicate all this time and money and effort to doing this work. What's happened since we started? We started 25 years ago, and we just have been focusing in the Kimberley for all that time. And in recent years, we've changed our name to Rock Art Australia. And what we're doing now is we're extending our research across the country. And there is significant rock art in every single state and territory in Australia. And it's such a big job. There's so much of it that is actually undocumented. It's not protected, it's not preserved, it hasn't been researched. And so there's a big job ahead of us as we move forward. And so it's wonderful to be here in Tasmania and to actually, learn about what's here. And we really want to build the relationships here. We want to understand what's here, and we want to work with the communities, and we want to work with the university researchers, and we want to collaborate and really work on telling our story. And I'd also love to encourage you to also just follow our work. We freely share our information. We're here, we're doing this lecture, and we'll be back with a film. We've actually made a documentary as well that we're going to share, and we really just want to keep spreading this information. So I want to encourage you to follow us. There's a QR code there that you can scan that will take you to our website, and you can link there to our newsletter. And we're also on social media. We share lots of research on social media. I would like to encourage you to also come to events and also share the information with your friends and your families. So thank you once again for joining us, and we look forward to speaking to you and engaging with you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samantha. And it's absolutely a pleasure for Rock Art Australia to be visiting us. It's such important work. We're very much looking forward to collaborating more in the future. I'd really like everybody to join me in thanking Greg, Ian, Andy, and Samantha. It's such an incredible privilege to hear from such fantastic, amazing, in-depth knowledge, cultural knowledge, scientific knowledge, collaboration. I'd like to offer my Yindimara, my absolute respect. It's a privilege as an Aboriginal person to learn from the amazing work. My other colleagues, brothers and sisters, nation family around the world, around Australia, around our beautiful islands. So thank you so much. And thank you so much, Samantha, for joining us and bringing this amazing talk to our space. Just an incredible privilege. Allow us to all say thank you with a clap.